Standing at rigid attention in the dimly lit wing of the grand Pentagon Auditorium, my chest tightened under the crisp wool of my army green service uniform as I looked down at the VIP row. 2 velvet cushioned seats sat noticeably, painfully empty, casting a long shadow over the sea of gold-braided shoulders and distinguished 4-star generals filling the polished hall. Just 3 hours earlier, the harsh, unforgiving voice of my biological father, Robert, had echoed through the receiver. His bitter words dripping with a cold, venomous disdain that still burned behind my eyes. He had hissed with absolute contempt that they would never stand beside someone who smelled of gunpowder, blood, and filthy sweat, declaring that my combat sacrifice was nothing more than an embarrassing disgrace to the family name. They had carelessly tossed the Pentagon's official gold-foiled invitation directly into the kitchen trash, preferring to spend their Friday evening at an obnoxiously expensive downtown steakhouse, celebrating my sister Chloe's latest cosmetic endorsement deal. Standing erect with my calloused hands clasped loosely behind my back in a perfect parade rest, I felt no tears hot against my cheeks, nor did my jaw tremble with suppressed rage. At 27 years old, having survived the darkest corners of human suffering, I had finally outgrown the desperate, hollow need for validation from people who viewed my existence as a transactional convenience. Those empty chairs did not represent my worthlessness. They marked the exact sanctuary where my dignity was born, leaving room for a true guardian who understood the real cost of quiet honor. Their arrogant meltdown tonight was mere child's play compared to the 5 brutal years of unrelenting hell I had swallowed whole in the Syrian desert. For half a decade, a mud-flooded trench carved behind rust-caked razor wire was my only permanent address, where my heavy 70-pound Kevlar plate carrier served as my primary winter blanket. My early 20s contained no casual weekend strolls through sunlit parks, no iced coffees, and no bright birthday candles flickering on sweet frosted cakes. There was only the deafening, chest-rattling crack of insurgent AK-47 fire punching through my eardrums at 2 a.m, shattering the freezing desert silence without warning. My tactical assault pack remained permanently stained brown with dried clay, stuffed tightly to the heavy zipper with combat gauze, cat tourniquets, and emergency auto-inject morphine vials. I chewed on dried, cardboard-tasting MRE meals in the dirt, my tired eyes glued to thermal optics hour after grueling hour, just to keep my infantry unit breathing for one more sunrise. My entire existence shrank down to a simple, brutal mathematics, dragging bleeding 18-year-old Americans out of lethal kill zones before they bled out on foreign soil. I earned a severe case of combat-induced PTSD for my troubles. The cruel kind that leaves you waking up in a cold sweat soaking your bedsheets every time you force your weary eyes shut. It was the silent trauma that compels you to hyper-vigilantly scan every rooftop when walking out of a quiet neighborhood grocery store back stateside, forever haunted by ghosts that ordinary civilians will never truly comprehend today. Yet, out there, in the absolute dead center of a combat zone, whenever a rare satellite phone actually caught a signal, My parents never held an ounce of genuine human concern for my survival. They never asked if I was intact, if my limbs were attached, or if I had lost soldiers in my squad. Every single call started and ended with a cold financial directive. I had originally set up a modest $500 monthly transfer to help them cover basic household utilities. But while I was dodging mortar shrapnel in Syria, Robert and Evelyn committed outright identity theft. They secretly used my social security number and forged my digital authorization to intercept my massive $80,000 combat reenlistment bonus, draining every single penny directly into their joint personal bank account. The money I earned by bleeding in combat was casually withdrawn to co-sign a luxury downtown skyline apartment lease for Chloe, a 22-year-old freelance content creator who didn't know the smell of burnt cordite from a cheap-scented candle. She was a girl who threw hysterical tantrums if her oat milk latte was made wrong, living in a high-rise suite built entirely upon my survival. I remember sitting alone on Christmas Eve in a freezing concrete bunker, wiping black gun grease off my raw hands just to clear her rent notifications today. In their warped minds, I wasn't a daughter serving her nation. I was a human ATM, an offshore gold mine established strictly to fund Chloe's fake internet lifestyle, while I took bullets so she could pretend to be self-made. For me, the final wake-up call arrived on a scorching Tuesday afternoon after a rebel shrapnel fragment tore through my left bicep during a brutal ambush outside the forward operating base. I sat on a rigid metal folding chair in the medical tent, grinding my teeth as a field medic poured rubbing alcohol directly into the gaping wound, the chemical fire chewing through raw muscle tissue. While he packed combat gauze into my arm to stop the profuse bleeding, I pulled up my banking app with my good hand, hoping to see enough funds reserved for private physical therapy once my deployment ended. Instead, my checking account hovered inches above zero, and before I could comprehend the missing funds, the heavy satellite phone rang. Robert was on the line, demanding an immediate $2,000 transfer for Chloe's Fashion Week wardrobe today. When I rasped that I had taken shrapnel and needed my remaining funds for medical recovery, refusing to send a single dime, Evelyn snatched the receiver and shrieked with venomous rage. She shrieked that Chloe had a social media image to maintain, mocking my life-saving combat work as filthy crawling in the dirt that nobody respected, callously asking why I even cared about keeping money when I had no real life to dress up for anyway. I didn't yell back or attempt to explain the sacred value of pulling dying kids out of burning Humvees. I simply pulled the phone away, pressed the red button with a blood-stained finger, and told the field medic to finish stitching my torn flesh. Less than a month later, the brutal reality of their unbridled entitlement crashed down upon me, past midnight, in a freezing concrete bunker, while scrolling through Instagram during Firewatch. A new photo popped up on Chloe's account, showing her standing beside a pristine $140,000 Mercedes G-Wagon in their paved driveway, flanked by Robert and Evelyn smiling with overflowing pride. The smug caption boasted about hard work paying off, but knowing their financial recklessness, My military intelligence training immediately kicked in as I logged into a secure public records database. Within 3 minutes, I uncovered the paper trail. They had taken out a predatory home equity line of credit, mortgaging their own home to fund her luxury vehicle, fully assuming my military allotments would cover the crushing monthly payments. Sitting alone in the dark, as the freezing desert wind violently rattled the steel bunker door, the last pathetic drop of biological loyalty I harbored for those people evaporated into thin air. I opened the Department of Defense MyPay portal, systematically tapping the screen to cancel every automatic transfer paying Chloe's rent, her VIP club dues, and their joint bank account. I opened my personnel file, highlighted Robert and Evelyn Watts on the emergency beneficiary list, pressed delete, and routed every dime of my combat pay into an encrypted high-yield account only I could access. As I powered off the phone screen, plunging the bunker into pitch blackness, I felt no sorrow, regret, or lingering anger. They had signed their own financial death warrant, and I had quietly cut the parachute today. The stillness after a long storm rarely feels like peace at first. Instead, it arrives as an awkward, heavy silence that sits on your chest like wet wool. In the early blue hours of autumn, Daniel stood on the sagging wooden porch, watching the mist drift off the valley floor like ghostly ribbons weaving through the bare pines. He wrapped his calloused fingers around a mug of black coffee, feeling the heat warm his nose. Yet, inside, the old winter remained locked behind his ribs. For months, he had carried the crushing weight of his brother's unspoken farewell, and the lingering ghost of a farm that had failed despite every drop of sweat he had poured into its exhausted soil. Hope, he realized, was not a sudden burst of lightning, but rather the frightening decision to stay present when every instinct urged him to turn away and vanish into the shadows. He watched a single hawk wheel lazily against the pale sky, effortlessly riding the rising thermal currents without fighting the air. How strange it was that nature never apologized for starting over, never hesitated to let the dead leaves fall to clear room for the next spring. Yet here he was, cataloging every flaw in his character, measuring his worth by the debris left in the wake of circumstances he could never have controlled. The cool morning breeze kissed his weathered cheek, subtle and undemanding, asking nothing of him except to draw one more slow, deliberate breath into his tired lungs, reminding him that simply surviving was noble courage. Walking down the overgrown path toward the neglected orchard behind the barn, Daniel felt the dry grass rustle softly against his worn work boots, sounding remarkably like old parchment turning in a forgotten book. The apple trees, planted by his grandfather 3 generations ago, stood twisted and unpruned, their branches heavy with small, knotty fruit that had survived the late summer frost against all reasonable odds. He reached out to cup a pale green apple in his palm, feeling the cool, slightly rough skin beneath his thumb, astonished by its silent, unyielding determination to grow despite months of utter neglect. As he stood there in the quiet, golden light, the distant latch of the garden gate clicked open, and Clara, his elderly neighbor from across the ridge, walked slowly up the gravel driveway, carrying a small woven basket covered with a clean white linen cloth. She did not offer empty platitudes of pity or demand explanations for his long withdrawal from the world. She merely smiled, her face carved into warm, familiar wrinkles by decades of hard living and gentle grace. "The earth keeps turning whether we feel ready or not, Daniel," she said softly, setting the basket of warm, freshly baked sourdough on the weathered bench beside him. Her voice possessed the steady resonance of a cello played in an empty church room, anchoring his drifting thoughts back to the immediate present. In that small, quiet exchange, without grand speeches or emotional spectacle, the thick ice surrounding his heart began to develop its very first invisible, microscopic healing cracks. That afternoon, sitting at the pine kitchen table, where generations of his family had eaten, prayed, and argued, Daniel opened the wooden tin where he kept his brother's final, brief letter. For months, he had treated those folded lines of black ink like radioactive material, convinced that opening them would destroy whatever fragile composure he had managed to rebuild. But as the autumn light slanted through the dusty window panes, casting warm amber rectangles onto the floorboards, he finally smoothed the creased paper flat with trembling fingers. The words were simple, free of accusation, asking only that Daniel forgive himself for things he could never fix, and live fully in the years ahead. Healing, Daniel began to understand in that quiet room, was not the art of forgetting the past, or pretending the wounds never existed in the first place. Rather, it was the painful, brave unlearning of self-punishment, the conscious choice to lay down heavy armor that was no longer protecting him from harm, but only isolating him from life. He wept then, not the wild, desperate weeping of grief that tears at the throat, but a quiet, cleansing rain that washed away years of harbored guilt and phantom responsibility. Forgiveness did not alter the tragedy of yesterday, but it suddenly stripped the sorrow of its power to command his tomorrow. With every breath, his chest expanded a little further, occupying the vast space where fear had previously made its permanent residence, allowing genuine peace to quietly settle back inside his soul, restoring his shattered sense of profound inner grace. By evening, the news of Daniel's quiet return to the land had traveled across the county like a gentle summer breeze through tall wheat, bringing 3 old friends to his driveway, carrying ladders, pruning saws, and heavy canvas sacks. They did not pry into his private sorrows or expect dramatic declarations of recovery. Instead, they simply rolled up their flannel sleeves and began helping him prune the overgrown apple orchard under the purpling twilight sky. Working alongside them, hearing the steady, rhythmical snap of dead branches falling to the earth, Daniel realized how foolishly he had believed that endurance meant suffering in solitary darkness. For years, he had defined masculine strength as an unyielding oak tree, standing alone against the gales, oblivious to the fact that oaks easily snap in violent storms, while willow thickets survive by bending together. As they gathered around an open bonfire late into the night, sharing Clara's warm bread and telling quiet stories of past harvests, the hollow distance that had separated Daniel from his fellow human beings evaporated into the cool evening mist. He spoke aloud for the first time about his fears, his voice steady despite the tender emotion underlying every syllable, and his friends listened in respectful, solemn silence. In their quiet nods and shared glances, he found a profound truth. Vulnerability was not the destruction of strength, but its truest, most resilient foundation. By allowing others to carry a portion of his heavy burden, he finally discovered the effortless lightness of being truly seen, deeply valued, and sincerely loved by all. When the first golden rays of the morning sun broke over the eastern ridge the next day, painting the valley in brilliant hues of crimson and honey, Daniel stepped onto the porch once more. The air was crisp and fresh, smelling of wet earth, wood smoke, and the clean scent of newly turned soil. Looking out over the orchard, where the neatly pruned branches stretched toward the brightening sky like open hands ready to receive the light, he felt a profound, settling stillness inside his soul. The scars from his past failures and grief had not vanished overnight, nor did he wish them to, for they were the indelible physical proof that he had weathered the hardest winter of his life and survived. He realized now that healing was not the absence of pain, but the presence of meaning. The quiet discovery that even a broken heart can hold an abundance of love and hope for the world. Reaching down into the soil beside the porch steps, he gathered a handful of rich, dark earth, feeling its damp texture between his coarse fingers, recognizing that from decay comes the richest nourishment for new life. With a calm smile gracing his face and a heart wide open to whatever blessings or challenges the future might bring, Daniel took a long step off the sagging wooden porch and walked toward the fields. He was no longer running from his history or bracing against the wind. He was simply moving forward, entirely whole, thoroughly healed, and genuinely alive at last under the endless sky. The greasy diner smelled suffocatingly of stale fryer oil, industrial bleach, and burnt coffee as the pale morning sun fought through the gray, overcast Washington sky. I sat quietly in a cracked vinyl booth, staring at the chipped ceramic mug in front of me, while across the sticky Formica table sat Sergeant First Class Maya Reyes. Maya and I had served 2 grueling deployment tours together in the desert, a hardened logistics specialist with a jagged scar running along her jawline, and a sharp mind that calculated complex tactical problems like a military supercomputer. I reached into my canvas jacket pocket, pulled out the gold-foiled Department of Defense invitation, and slid the heavy cardstock across the scratched table, directly toward her calloused hands. I delivered the news in a flat tone, explaining that my biological parents had arrogantly rejected the ceremony to attend a commercial steakhouse dinner, leaving their reserved VIP seat completely empty. Maya picked up the textured invitation, her sharp eyes scanning the raised gold lettering without offering a sympathetic head tilt or an empty, pitying pat on my hand. She was a battle-tested soldier who understood that hollow pity was entirely useless in the field. Tossing the heavy envelope back onto the table with a low, gravelly rasp, she looked me dead in the eyes and declared that we were never leaving an open gap in my battle formation, insisting that we needed a real human body in that front row chair, someone who had actually earned the sacred right to watch me receive the Silver Star today. While Maya opened her heavy Panasonic military Toughbook laptop to handle logistics, I pulled out my phone and scrolled past the blocked numbers of my parents to find the one contact I truly trusted. Martha Sullivan was Evelyn's older sister, but the two women were polar opposites in every imaginable human dimension. While my mother spent her life chasing country club memberships and superficial status, Martha spent 30 years working as a dedicated trauma nurse at a Veterans Affairs hospital, pulling shrapnel out of wounded kids and holding the hands of dying men. When I was shivering in a mud-flooded Syrian trench, it was never Evelyn who checked on my survival. It was Martha who sent heavy cardboard care packages every single month like clockwork. Inside those boxes, I never found useless trinkets. I found vacuum-sealed combat gauze, heavy wool socks, and tin boxes of homemade shortbread cookies. She never asked me for a single dime of my combat pay, sending only survival gear and unconditional love. I dialed her number, and after 2 brief rings, Martha's warm, raspy voice filled the speaker above the gentle hum of a washing machine in her Oregon home. When I quietly explained that I had a VIP ticket for a Pentagon ceremony this Friday and needed her on a plane to Washington, D.C., there was no hesitation or complaint about her busy schedule. She simply rasped that she didn't care about the military brass, wanting only to see me with her own eyes, telling me to name the flight time today. 24 hours later, I pulled my pickup truck up to the bustling arrival curb at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, where the smell of raw jet fuel and humid engine exhaust fumes filled the afternoon air. The automatic sliding glass doors parted, and Aunt Martha stepped out into the light, wearing a simple, unpretentious wool coat and pulling a heavily scuffed, beat-up Samsonite suitcase behind her. It was an old piece of luggage that looked like nothing compared to the thousands of dollars of designer leather my mother and sister arrogantly paraded around. But to me, that scuffed bag was the most beautiful sight in the world. I put the truck in park, stepped out onto the warm pavement, and Martha dropped her heavy suitcase right onto the concrete to close the distance between us without a second of hesitation. She wrapped her arms around my shoulders in a bone-crushing embrace that smelled comfortingly of fresh peppermint and clean laundry detergent, instantly grounding my hyper-vigilant military spirit. She pulled back just enough to look into my eyes, her calloused, aging fingers reaching up to gently trace the edge of the tactical jacket covering my freshly stitched left bicep. As a veteran VA trauma nurse, she understood precisely what hot metal shrapnel did to human muscle tissue, her eyes welling with silent tears that she refused to let fall across her cheeks. She whispered softly that I was still standing, and I nodded in quiet, unshakable affirmation, confirming that I was indeed still standing strong, despite the storms of battle today. We drove back to my apartment, where the elegant navy blue evening gown Maya had expedited from a boutique in Georgetown hung perfectly on the closet door frame, its heavy fabric soft and immaculate. That evening, the three of us sat together in my quiet living room, creating an atmosphere whose peace stood in jarring contrast to the toxic, chaotic house of my biological parents. There was no trashy reality television screaming from a massive flat screen, no frantic panic over a bounced rent check, and no narcissistic family members demanding cash transfers to maintain a fake online lifestyle. There was only the quiet, comforting hum of the refrigerator as Martha sat on the sofa, cradling a warm cup of black tea, offering me her undivided, compassionate attention. She didn't talk about herself. She simply listened with deep respect as I recounted the brutal reality of the ambush, describing the choking dust, the deafening mortar cracks, and the heavy weight of the 12 brave men I pulled from the kill zone. She understood the true cost of the Silver Star, knowing that genuine honor was forged in blood and quiet sacrifice. Looking at Maya, leaning against the kitchen counter, sipping a cold drink, and at Martha sitting beside me, a profound truth settled into my spirit. Family is not a faulty string of shared DNA, nor is it the parasites who demand a cut of your hard-earned paycheck while you bleed. Real family consists of the chosen souls who lock shields beside you when the heavy mortars start falling. Today, at exactly 7 o'clock on Friday evening, the massive oak doors of the Pentagon Auditorium slammed shut, the heavy thud echoing like a solemn gunshot that sealed the quiet room from the outside world. Hundreds of distinguished 4-star generals, high-ranking defense officials, and the National Press Corps packed the velvet seats, the air smelling sharp of brass polish, starched wool, and ozone from heavy lighting rigs. The giant crystal chandeliers overhead dimmed to a low glow, while a row of red tally lights on the network broadcast cameras snapped on, broadcasting live across the entire nation today. Standing at the back of the auditorium in my immaculate Army green service uniform, with my medals polished and my shoulders squared, I looked over at Aunt Martha standing beside me in her navy blue gown. She held her head high, her hands resting calmly against her dress, carrying herself with the unpretentious dignity of a woman who had spent 30 years serving humanity without ever expecting a single public accolade. Maya gave us a crisp, silent nod from the aisle, her sharp eyes reflecting fierce pride as she watched us take our first steps forward down the plush red carpet. We walked with measured, steady strides toward the front row, taking our reserved VIP seats right in front of the main stage, under the blinding press lights. Sitting beside the woman who had truly supported my survival, I felt no lingering ache for the parents who had abandoned me. The formation was complete, and I was finally ready. For months, the weight of everything left unsaid had hung over him like a frost that refused to yield to the sun, a cold residue of unspoken grief that had settled deep into the marrow of his bones. But on this particular dawn, standing on the weathered porch of the cabin, he felt a subtle shift in the air, a gentle invitation to stop running from his own shadow. The silence of the woods was no longer an empty void meant to be feared. It was a vast, open sanctuary, holding space for his breath. He looked down at his calloused hands that had tried so desperately to hold on to what was destined to slip away, and for the first time, he let them rest loosely at his sides. There was a profound beauty in surrender, not the defeat of a weary warrior laying down his weapons, but the surrender of a tree letting go of its dry leaves so the roots could survive the winter. He took a long, slow breath, inhaling the crisp, pine-scented air that burned pleasantly in his chest, feeling the sharp reality of the present moment overwrite the haunting echoes of the past. The pain had not vanished entirely, but its fierce edge had softened into something manageable, a quiet reminder that he was still alive, still feeling, and still profoundly capable of finding his way back home to himself. Later that afternoon, he walked down the dirt road toward the town square, where the golden light of early autumn filtered through the amber leaves of the oak trees. Near the old library, Mrs. Gable was tending to her small flower garden, her hands buried in the dark, rich soil with a familiar tenderness that only years of quiet patience could cultivate. She looked up as he approached, her eyes crinkling at the corners with a warmth that required no explanations or polite pleasantries. Without asking about his long absence or the shadows that had kept him away, she simply offered him a freshly picked sunflower, its heavy yellow head leaning trustingly against her palm. Some things need the dark earth just to learn how to stretch toward the sun, she said softly, her voice carrying the slow, reassuring rhythm of someone who had weathered her own share of harsh winters. He took the stem, feeling the coarse texture against his thumb, and felt a sudden knot in his throat loosen. It was a simple, unadorned gesture, yet it carried the immense weight of human connection, a reminder that grace often arrives without ceremony, delivered by hands that know what it means to heal. In her quiet presence, he understood that he did not have to carry his history as a solitary burden. He was part of a larger, living landscape, surrounded by people who had also been broken and rebuilt, anchored by the subtle, enduring bonds of shared, quiet strength. As he walked away, the bright bloom in his hand felt like an anchor of light, guiding him through the afternoon. By evening, he sat at his old wooden desk, watching the twilight paint the room in deep shades of indigo and soft violet. The blank pages of his journal, which had mocked his silence for so many agonizing months, now lay open like a welcoming friend. For a long time, he had believed that healing meant erasing the past, carving away the fractured pieces until no scars remained to speak of what had happened. But as he touched the nib of his pen to the paper, a deeper truth illuminated his mind like a lantern in the dark. Wholeness was not the absence of fracture, but the courageous integration of every piece that had ever broken off. The grief, the mistakes, the moments of paralyzing fear, they were not blemishes to be hidden away in shame, but the very threads that gave the tapestry of his soul its strength and texture. His pen began to move, spilling ink across the cream-colored pages with a fluid, unhurried rhythm that felt like releasing a trapped breath. He wrote about the long nights of doubt, the quiet moments of mercy, and the subtle beauty of surviving when giving up had seemed so tantalizingly easy. Each sentence was an act of reconciliation with himself, a bridge built between who he had been and who he was becoming. He was no longer trying to curate a perfect narrative. He was simply honoring the raw, messy, and sacred truth of his own human story, finding peace in the realization that every fracture had allowed a little more light to filter through. The following morning brought a crisp breeze that rustled through the canopy of trees, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of turning seasons and fresh beginnings. He stepped out onto the path, carrying a small wooden toolbox he had not touched in over a year, intending to repair the fallen fence near the edge of the creek. Each blow of the hammer against the sturdy timber echoed across the quiet meadow, a steady, rhythmic cadence that felt remarkably like a heart regaining its natural momentum. The physical labor was demanding, coaxing sweat from his brow and aching muscles that had grown soft during his long isolation. But the pain felt good, clean, and grounding. It was a tangible proof of life returning, of hands creating order out of decay. With every post he set into the earth, and every board he nailed tightly into place, he was not merely repairing a physical boundary. He was actively reclaiming his place in the tangible world. Passers-by along the country road nodded in quiet acknowledgement. And instead of pulling back into the protective shell of his solitude, he smiled back and returned their greetings with an open heart. Vulnerability was no longer a dangerous exposure to harm, but the essential doorway through which genuine connection and joy could enter. He had spent so long building walls to keep out the pain that he had accidentally locked out the light. But now, with each deliberate strike of his hammer, he was building bridges back to the world, standing firmly upon the solid ground of his own quiet resilience. As dusk fell softly over the valley, casting long golden shadows across the newly mended fence, he walked up to the high ridge overlooking the river below. The sky above was a breathtaking canvas of burning gold, soft crimson, and deep indigo, reflecting off the winding water like liquid starlight. He stood there quietly, feeling the cool mountain wind lift his hair, listening to the gentle evening song of the crickets rising from the tall grass. There was no longer a restless urgency inside him to find immediate answers to every lingering question, nor a desperate desire to rewrite the painful chapters that had brought him to this point. Looking back across the immense distance he had traveled, not just the physical miles of dirt road, but the arduous internal journey through grief, self-doubt, and patient healing, he felt an overwhelming sense of quiet gratitude. Life had not become simple overnight, nor had the world lost its inherent capacity to wound. But he had discovered a quiet center within himself that could not be shaken by any storm. He knew now that hope was not a foolish illusion or a fragile wish, but a deliberate, courageous choice to open one's eyes to the light every single morning. A deep, unbreakable sense of peace settled over his spirit, as vast and enduring as the twilight horizon stretching endlessly out before him. Smiling gently at the first bright stars beginning to ignite in the darkening sky, He took a deep, steady breath, feeling ready to embrace whatever tomorrow might bring, fully alive, completely whole, and forever transformed. The morning air in the valley carried the sharp, familiar scent of pine and damp earth, a scent that had haunted his dreams for a decade, like a song whose lyrics were lost to time. Standing before the worn wooden gate of the sanctuary he had fled so long ago, Daniel felt the quiet weight of every unuttered apology pressing against his chest. The white paint was peeling now, revealing the weathered gray timber beneath, a silent witness to the relentless march of seasons that cared nothing for human grief. For years, he had operated under the comforting delusion that distance was synonymous with healing, believing that crossing state lines and building a life of calculated noise could drown out the echo of what was broken. But sitting in the silence of his own making, he had finally understood that running merely lengthens the shadow behind you. He pushed the gate open, its rusty hinges issuing a groan that felt less like a warning and more like a long overdue sigh of recognition. The overgrown lawn was scattered with golden leaves, shimmering under the soft October sunlight that filtered through the canopy of ancient oaks. Each step forward felt heavy, yet inexplicably necessary, a pilgrimage back to the exact coordinate where his heart had first hardened. He was no longer the restless young man consumed by pride, ambition, and fear, but a weary traveler coming home to make peace with the lingering ghost of who he used to be. He sat on the porch steps, watching a solitary monarch butterfly navigate the gentle autumn breeze, its fragile wings carrying a quiet resilience that seemed almost miraculous given the harshness of the surrounding world. Inside the house, sunlight traced dusty geometric patterns across the hardwood floor, illuminating the empty spaces where laughter and heated arguments had once filled the warm air. In the stillness of that afternoon, a profound shift began to unfold within his consciousness, quiet as the changing of the guard. He realized that for all those bitter years, he had been viewing his scars as permanent marks of failure, rather than undeniable proof of survival. We spend so much of our finite lives trying to polish away the fractures, desperate to present a seamless facade to a world that rarely looks closely enough to truly care. Yet, like the Japanese art of repair, where broken ceramics are bound with gold, our true beauty lies not in our pristine, unblemished states, but in the luminous seams where we were carefully put back together. The silence around him was no longer cold or accusing. It was a vast, gentle mirror, reflecting the simple, undeniable truth that suffering was not an interruption of his journey, but its very soil. The anger that had fueled his stride for so long slowly evaporated into the twilight, leaving behind a clear, unburdened clarity that allowed him to breathe deeply for what felt like the first time in an entire decade. Reaching into his coat pocket, Daniel pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook whose pages were filled with scribbled grievances and unanswered questions he had carried like heavy stones in his pockets. He turned to a blank page, took out a pen, and began to write, not with the furious urgency of his youth, but with the measured grace of a man who had finally tired of war. He wrote to the father who could never express love in words, to the friends who had drifted into the fog of forgotten promises, and ultimately, to himself, the frightened boy who thought he had to carry the entire world on his narrow shoulders. With every word that bled onto the paper, a physical knot in his shoulders began to loosen, releasing decades of accumulated tension. Forgiveness, he finally grasped, was never about pardoning the past or pretending the wounds never existed. It was an act of mercy, directed inward. A conscious decision to unclamp his hands from the hot coal of resentment. As he tore the page from the book and let the gentle afternoon wind carry it across the golden field, he felt light, almost weightless, as if the gravity that had kept him bound to his sorrow had suddenly lost its hold. The act was simple, almost trivial to an outside observer, but within the private landscape of his soul, it was an earthquake that leveled the walls he had spent a lifetime building. A soft crunch of gravel announced the arrival of Sarah, walking up the driveway with 2 warm ceramic mugs in her hands, her presence as steady and comforting as the autumn dusk settling over the hills. She didn't offer superficial platitudes or demand explanations for his long absence. She simply sat down beside him on the steps, handing him a mug of tea while steam rose slowly into the cool air. In that shared, comfortable silence, an unspoken bridge was rebuilt across the chasm of lost time. Proof that true love and deep friendship do not demand perfection, only presence. Her quiet companionship reminded him that healing is rarely a solitary endeavor. While the inward journey must be walked alone, the light that guides us back usually shines from the eyes of those who refuse to leave us in the dark. They talked low and slow as the sky shifted from fiery orange to deep indigo, speaking not of the painful yesterday, but of the small, beautiful details of today. The harvest in the valley, the blue jays nesting in the porch eaves, the simple rhythm of living. He listened, really listened, without the defensive armor he used to wear, letting her comforting words wash over him like a warm tide. In the soft glow of the porch light, he realized that humanity's greatest courage is not in remaining invulnerable, but in daring to stay open, fragile, and soft in a world that so often tempts us to freeze. Night fell completely, laying a blanket of brilliant stars across the endless velvet sky, each constellation a reminder of how small our troubles are in the grand tapestry of the cosmos. Daniel stood up, feeling the solid, cool earth beneath his feet, no longer rooted in the regret of what was lost, but grounded in the quiet promise of what could still be made. He looked back at the old house, no longer seeing a monument to his pain, but a protective shell that had held him until he was strong enough to break free and fly. Tomorrow would bring its own share of uncertainty, its own storms and triumphs, but he knew now that he possessed the inner quiet needed to navigate whatever lay beyond the horizon. The road ahead was long and winding, disappearing into the dark woods. Yet, for the first time in his memory, he felt no urge to run or hide from it. He took a deep breath of the cold night air, feeling the steady beat of his heart in his chest, a rhythmic, persistent reminder that as long as there is breath, there is always the capacity to begin again. With a soft smile touching his lips, he turned toward the gentle light of the porch, stepped inside, and closed the door behind him. Ready at last to live not in the shadow of his history, but in the vibrant, unfolding glory of his present. The morning arrived, not with a sudden burst of sunlight, but with a slow, blue-gray dusk turning softly into gold along the ridge of the eastern hills. Standing on the worn pine porch, wrapped in a blanket that still carried the familiar scent of cedar and dried lavender, she watched the frost thaw on the grass blades like silver dust melting back into the earth. It was hard to pinpoint the exact moment when the heavy weight in her chest had begun to lessen. But here, in the cold hush of dawn, the absence of that old bitterness felt almost tangible. For years, grief had been a restless, vigilant sentinel, guarding every boundary of her heart against the possibility of further harm. Yet, as the first rays of light filtered through the bare branches of the sycamore tree, casting long, gentle shadows across the yard, she realized that defense had slowly turned into a cage. The silence no longer felt hollow or accusatory. Instead, it possessed a spaciousness that offered room to breathe without apology. She breathed in the crisp bite of the autumn air, letting it fill the furthest reaches of her lungs, feeling the subtle pulse of life that had quietly sustained her through the darkest seasons. There was an unspoken forgiveness in the way the land welcomed the morning, indifferent to the storms of yesterday, entirely present to the possibility of warmth. In that quiet intersection of memory and mourning, she allowed her shoulders to drop, finally surrendering the quiet battle she had fought against her own endurance. She walked down the narrow dirt path toward the riverbank, where the clear mountain water tumbled over smooth gray cobblestones with an unhurried, steady rhythm. In her coat pocket rested a small paper envelope, its edges soft and frayed from years of being unfolded, reread, and tucked away in moments of aching doubt. It contained all the unsent letters, the unspoken explanations, and the sharp regrets that had anchored her to a past she could neither rewrite nor reclaim. Standing at the water's edge, where yellow birch leaves floated like tiny golden boats upon the current, she pulled the paper out and held it between her calloused fingers. The ink had faded into a soft violet hue, quietly reflecting the gradual softening of her own heart over the long seasons. She did not burn it in a dramatic gesture of anger, nor did she weep for what might have been. Instead, she gently laid the folded sheets upon the cold, clear surface of the rushing stream. For a brief second, the paper lingered in a shallow eddy, swirling near her leather boots, before the current caught it and carried it downstream toward the wider valley below. Watching it disappear beneath the gentle curve of the willow trees, a profound stillness settled over her soul, clean, tranquil, and entirely unburdened. We do not heal by erasing the broken fractures of our human history, she understood with quiet certainty, but by allowing the steady water of grace to wash over the jagged edges until they become smooth enough to hold, without pain. When she stepped back into the kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee and roasted pecans filled the warm, wood-paneled room, soft and welcoming against the chilly morning air outside. Sitting at the rustic oak table, fingers wrapped around a steaming stoneware mug, was the person who had quietly shared in her long silence, waiting patiently, without demanding explanations she was not yet ready to give. Their eyes met across the simple wooden surface, carrying no lingering residue of old grievances or defensive pride, but only a deep, abiding recognition of mutual survival. "It is quiet out there today," he said softly, his voice carrying the calm, steady cadence of someone who had learned to love through the quietest storms. She sat down opposite him, feeling the solid wood beneath her hands, grounding her in the tangible reality of the present moment. For years, she had believed that connection required perfection, that love was something earned through flawless strength and unyielding resilience. Yet, in the comfortable ease between them, where every sigh was accepted and every scar understood, she saw the profound beauty of human imperfection. They did not need to speak of the hard years or try to measure who had suffered more. The simple act of sitting together, sharing warmth and drinking coffee in the morning light, was testament enough to the enduring strength of their unbroken bond. In this quiet sanctuary, words were no longer shields to protect themselves, but gentle bridges built to carry them across the remaining distance toward a quiet, shared, and peaceful tomorrow. Later that afternoon, as the amber sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, throwing warm ribbons across the honey-colored floorboards, she went out into the small backyard garden to clear the dry flower beds for winter. Digging her bare hands into the cool, dark soil, she felt an unexpected sensation of gratitude rise within her. Not just for the peaceful joy of the present, but for the dark, difficult valleys that had brought her here. Pain, she realized while cradling a handful of earth, was not a punishment meant to destroy the spirit, but a rough plow that turned over the hard ground of the heart so that something deeper and more genuine could take root. Without the sorrow that had stripped away her illusions, she would never have learned the delicate art of self-compassion, nor would she have recognized the quiet majesty of ordinary days. Every trial had been a harsh teacher, yet each had left behind a gift of clarity, teaching her to treasure what remains rather than mourn what was lost. As she tucked dry bulbs beneath the earth to sleep through the coming frost, she knew they would burst into vibrant bloom when spring returned, following the ancient, unspoken promise of the seasons. Healing was not the absence of scars, but the quiet realization that one's spirit was vast enough to encompass both memory and hope, sorrow and joy, without being fractured by either. She wiped her hands clean on her apron, feeling a deep, steady contentment settling into her bones, knowing that she had finally come home. As twilight began to fold across the landscape, painting the horizon in soft strokes of indigo and crimson, she returned to the porch to watch the evening stars emerge one by one above the dark, silhouetted pines. The night air was crisp and full of the quiet promise of autumn, carrying the distant, comforting scent of wood smoke drifting from neighboring chimneys down the valley. She looked out at the road winding away into the darkness, the same road that had once felt like an intimidating path into uncertainty and endless solitude. Now, it looked like an open invitation, a gentle pathway leading toward new stories, new encounters, and deeper understanding. Life was not a problem to be solved, or a broken vessel to be meticulously repaired, but an unfolding mystery to be lived with courage, presence, and an open heart. She folded her hands in her lap, feeling the warm pulse of her own life force, steady and serene, echoing the slow rhythm of the turning earth beneath her feet. She took one deep breath of the cool night air, letting a quiet gratitude fill every corner of her being. There was no need to hurry toward the future or linger wistfully in the shadows of the past. The present moment was whole, complete, and infinitely rich in grace. Stepping inside as the porch light bathed the doorway in a warm, golden glow, she closed the door softly behind her, ready to step into tomorrow with a quiet, unwavering peace, knowing that love and light would always find their way home.